Ballistics math breaks down past 3 kilometers, becoming a guessing game played with wind and planetary spin. Every instructor at Coronado called 3,800 meters a statistical ghost, a mathematical impossibility. They changed their minds when 14 consecutive copper jackets tore through the exact same freezing thermal pocket. Cold air tasted like rusted iron at 9,000 feet. Nyari Teague didn't look like a pioneer. She looked like a pile of discarded burlap sacks wedged between 2 jagged plates of shale. Her left hip had gone entirely numb 3 hours ago, compressed against a root that bit through her uniform, but she didn't shift her weight. Movement on a barren ridgehead was a luxury for people who didn't mind a heavy-caliber counter-sniper round clearing out their sinuses. Beside her, Owen Cord spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into a hollow rock. The liquid froze almost instantly into a dull brown crust. He didn't look at her. He hadn't looked at her directly since they spun up from the staging base in Oman. To Cord and to the rest of the team gathered in the defilade 40 meters behind them, Nyari was an administrative anomaly, a bureaucratic checkbox forced into a Tier 1 unit because her data sheets looked pristine on a Pentagon projector. "Wind is shifting 3 milliradians left," Cord muttered. His voice scraped raw by the altitude and a week of cheap military coffee. He kept his eye glued to the Leupold spotting scope, his knuckles white where they gripped the focus ring. Forget the canyon floor. Look at the grey scrub on the middle terrace. It's bending south. If you fire now, your drift will put the round in the next zip code. Nyari didn't answer. She didn't want to waste the moisture in her throat. Her tongue felt like sandpaper, and her lips were split wide enough to bleed if she smiled. She liked the silence anyway. It kept her from having to explain the things her eyes did naturally. The way she didn't just look at the scrub, but at the faint, oily shimmer of cold air falling into the warmer thermal pockets of the lower valley. Her weapon was a custom-barreled .416 Barrett, a monster of a rifle that weighed nearly 30 pounds, with the bipod and the heavy suppression can. It wasn't standard issue for the team, but she had fought 3 logistics officers and a master chief to keep it. The boys liked the .50 caliber because it smashed through engine blocks, but Nyari preferred the sleek, low-drag profile of the .416. It stayed supersonic longer. It didn't tumble when it hit the sound barrier. It was a tool for a surgeon, not a demolition derby. Through her night-into-day optic, the world was a study in shades of charcoal and pale green. Far below, at the base of the jagged valley, an Army Special Forces ODA team was pinned down inside a dry irrigation ditch. Their Humvee was already a blackened husk, sending a greasy column of diesel smoke straight up into the morning air. Nyari could hear their tactical radio chatter leaking through Cord's earpiece. A frantic, high-pitched loop of coordinates and demands for close air support that wasn't coming, because the low-hanging cloud deck had grounded the Apaches 3 valleys over. "TOC, this is Dagger 2-1, the radio crackled, the voice belonging to some 22-year-old sergeant whose lungs were bursting with terror. "We have heavy machine gun fire from the northern tower. We can't move the casualties, requesting immediate suppression." Commander Trace Castillo's voice came back from the Tactical Operations Center 50 miles away, sounding hollow and powerless. "Dagger, air is holding at the Tier 1 line. We have Teague on the ridge. Acknowledge." A long pause followed on the net. Then a short, bitter transmission from the ditch. "The girl. Sir, we are 1,200 meters from the ridge wall. The target is another 2,000 behind that. She's over 3 clicks out. Just tell her to shoot the heavy stuff to make some noise." Nyari heard it. She didn't blink. She just pulled the stock deeper into the pocket of her shoulder, feeling the hard rubber press against the permanent yellow and blue bruise that had formed there over a decade of shooting. Her heart rate was 48 beats per minute. She had spent 5 years learning how to drop her pulse between breaths, how to find that tiny, quiet room inside her own chest where nothing existed except the trigger sear and the crosshair. "They don't think you can see them," Cord said, his tone lacking its previous bite, replaced by the grim realization that the men in the ditch were likely going to die within the hour. "Hell, I can barely see the tower through the spotting scope. The mirage is boiling down there. It looks like looking through a fishbowl." "Shut up, Cord," she said, her voice a low, raspy click. It was the first time she had spoken since midnight. She adjusted her elevation turret. The clicks were heavy, metallic, and precise. She was dialed to the absolute limit of the scope's internal travel, forcing her to hold another 12 milliradians high on the reticle, just to account for the massive, parabolic drop of the bullet. At 3,800 meters, the round wouldn't fly straight. It would arc through the sky like an artillery shell, rising hundreds of feet into the thin mountain air before plunging down toward the earth. She checked her data card, a sweat-stained piece of laminate taped to her forearm. Distance, 3,822 meters. Time of flight, 4.4 seconds. Core drop, 114 feet. Every instinct a normal shooter possessed was useless here. If she looked at the target, she was looking at the past. By the time her bullet arrived, the world would have changed. The wind would have shifted twice. The Earth itself would have rotated several inches eastward beneath the bullet's path. The Coriolis effect, a piece of planetary physics that most soldiers only read about in textbooks, but Nyari had to live by. "You're going to miss," Cord whispered, though he didn't move away from his glass. "Nobody hits at 3.8. The record is 3.4, and that guy had 3 practice shots to walk it in. These guys don't have 3 shots to give you." Nyari took a slow breath in through her nose, tasting the dust from the shale. She held it for 2 seconds, letting the oxygen settle in her blood, then let half of it out. Her finger, covered in a thin layer of green Nomex material where she had cut the tip off the glove, touched the cold curved steel of the trigger. She didn't pull. She squeezed, waiting for the space between her heartbeats. The rifle didn't loud boom like an unsuppressed weapon. Instead, it produced a massive, low-frequency thud that shook the loose shale beneath Nyari's chest and sent a small puff of grey dust out from the muzzle brake. The recoil was immense, a heavy, blunt force shove that moved her entire 30-pound frame back an inch, breaking her sight picture for a fraction of a second. She recovered instantly, resetting her eye behind the glass. 1, Cord counted, his voice flat. 2, 3, 4. Down in the valley, a man in a black wool vest was leaning over the parapet of the mud brick tower, clearing a jam on a heavy DSHK machine gun. He was 3 miles away from the ridge, totally unaware that 27 grams of solid copper were screaming toward him out of the grey sky at twice the speed of sound. The bullet arrived before the sound of the shot did. Through the high magnification optic, Nyari saw the man's upper torso simply vanish into a red cloud. The impact was so violent, it threw his body backward over the rear wall of the tower, out of sight. Cord went completely rigid. His hand froze on the focusing knob of the spotting scope. For 5 seconds, the only sound on the ridge was the wind whistling through the dry shale and the distant, tinny rattle of gunfire from the irrigation ditch. "Confirm," Cord said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all of its cynical edge. "Target is down. Headshot. Jesus Christ, Nyari. That had to be a fluke." "Load," she said. She pulled the massive bolt back. The empty casing flew out, hissing as it hit the freezing rocks, the smell of burnt single-base powder sharp and clean in the cold air. She pushed a fresh round into the chamber and locked the bolt down with a heavy, mechanical clunk. "Second gunner is moving up," Cord said, his words coming faster now, his professional veneer cracking to reveal something approaching panic. "He's trying to drag the DSHK back into the shadow. Wait, he's looking around. He doesn't know where it came from." Of course he didn't. At nearly 4 kilometers, the sound of the rifle would take over 10 seconds to reach the valley floor. And by then, it would be nothing more than a faint rumble, indistinguishable from the rocks shifting or the wind blowing through the canyon walls. To the men in the tower, death was arriving with complete anonymity. Nyari didn't adjust her turrets. The first shot had confirmed her math. The wind pocket inside the middle terrace was holding a steady, invisible river of air that she had successfully mapped in her head. She found her point of aim again, holding the crosshairs nearly 2 building stories above the target's head into the empty grey sky. She squeezed. The second thud shook the ridge. 4 seconds later, the second gunner collapsed sideways across the tripod of the machine gun, his turban unraveling as he slid into the dirt. "2," Cord whispered. He wasn't looking at his data sheets anymore. He was staring at the back of Nyari's helmet as if she were a ghost. 2 for 2. That's impossible. The thermal drift down there should be shifting by now. "They're running out of the bunker to reinforce the tower," Nyari said, her voice steady, though her shoulder was starting to throb from the repeated impact of the heavy stock. 3 men, moving left to right along the communication trench. "I see them," Cord said, scrambling to adjust his field of view. "They're running. You can't lead them at this distance, Teague. The lead has to be 30 feet. 34 feet, she corrected him. She didn't wait for him to confirm. She tracked the lead runner. In her scope, he looked like a tiny green ant crawling across a line of mud. She timed his pace, counting the rhythm of his steps. He was heavy, clumsy, carrying an extra ammunition box that threw off his balance. She fired the 3rd round. Then, without waiting to see it hit, she cycled the bolt, chambered the 4th, and fired again, shifting her aim to the 2nd man who had stopped to look at his comrade. Through the spotting scope, Cord watched the sequence play out like a delayed film strip. The lead runner suddenly tripped and slid face first into the dirt, his body twitching once before going still. A second later, the man behind him, who had stopped to help, had his head snapped back by an invisible hammer. 4, Cord said. His voice was trembling now. He reached down to his tactical vest and pulled out his radio, keying the mic with a shaking thumb. "TOC, this is Cord. Be advised. Teague has 4 confirmed KIA on the northern tower and trench. All headshots. Repeat, all headshots." The radio remained silent for nearly 10 seconds. When Castillo's voice came back, it lacked its usual command room authority. "Say again, Cord. Did you say 4? 4, Cord repeated, eyes glued back to the glass. And she's still behind the gun. Nyari's world had shrunk to a circle of glass and the smell of hot metal. Her shoulder was starting to stiffen, the muscle fibers protesting against the violent kick of the Barrett. She could feel a thin line of liquid running down her neck. Her nose had started to bleed from the rapid altitude change and the pressure waves of the large muzzle brake firing so close to the ground. She didn't wipe it away. It tasted like iron when it reached her lip. The insurgents inside the compound knew they were being targeted now, but they were looking in the wrong direction. They had aimed their small arms toward the opposite ridge, 2,000 meters closer, assuming the fire was coming from an advanced scout team. 2 men ran out of the main building toward an operational mortar pit, desperate to get smoke or high explosives into the air to cover their retreat. Nyari found the first mortarman in her reticle. He was kneeling, dropping a shell into the tube. Breathe, hold, squeeze. The rifle recoiled. She cycled the bolt before the casing even cleared the port. The fifth man dropped before his mortar shell left the tube. The second mortarman turned to run back toward the safety of the mud walls, his legs pumping frantically through the deep sand of the courtyard. Nyari didn't feel pity. She didn't feel pride. She felt like an accountant clearing rows on a ledger. She tracked him, let her breath out, and took the sixth shot. The man fell in the middle of the courtyard, his arms outflung, his face pressed into the grey dirt. 6, Cord counted, his voice now a hollow whisper. He had stopped looking at the target through the lens. He was just listening to the regular, rhythmic thud-clack-click of Nyari's rifle. It was a mechanical rhythm, precise and cold, like a grandfather clock ticking away the remaining seconds of 14 lives. Panic manifested in the valley as a chaotic scramble of grey static across Nyari's thermal lens. Men who had survived a decade of brutal mountain warfare suddenly forgot their training. They abandoned cover. They ran in unpredictable, jagged lines, searching the adjacent hills for a sniper who was mathematically too far away to exist. Cord had transformed. The cynical, tobacco-chewing skeptic who had dismissed her 3 hours ago was gone, replaced by a hyper-focused observer whose voice was a metronome of lethal precision. Target 7 is attempting to flank the ditch from the eastern wadi, Cord said, his eye never leaving the glass. He's moving into the shadow of the overhang. You have a 2-foot window between the rock outcropping and the mud wall. Nyari adjusted her position, shifting her hips an inch to the right. The movement sent a spasm of sharp, electric pain down her left leg. The cold had settled deep into her joints, turning her synovial fluid into thick sludge. Her jaw ached from clenching. The dried blood under her nose cracked, flaking onto her frozen lips. She ignored it all, trapping the pain in a mental lockbox, and dialed her windage turret back 2 clicks to compensate for a sudden lull in the thermal updraft. "Sending," she croaked. The rifle roared, slamming backward into her bruised shoulder. The pain was no longer a dull ache, it was a sharp, localized fire, as if someone were driving a hot rivet into her collarbone with a mallet. She didn't flinch. 4.4 seconds later, the man in the wadi dropped, his momentum carrying him forward into the dirt. 7, Cord confirmed, his breathing shallow. 8 is freezing at the corner of the northern building. He's looking at the guy you just dropped. He's static. "Hold," Nyari whispered. She stared through the optic. The mirage was getting worse. As the morning sun finally crested the eastern peaks, the ground in the valley began to heat up, sending violent ripples of thermal distortion upward. The image of the 8th man wobbled in her scope like a reflection in a disturbed pond. If she shot now, the refraction of light through the heat waves meant the man wasn't actually where he appeared to be. She waited. 7 seconds. 10 seconds. The ODA team in the ditch was screaming over the radio for an update, their medic frantically calling out heart rates and blood loss volumes for 2 wounded soldiers. "Teague, they're bleeding out down there," Cord warned, tension tightening his vocal cords. "Wait," she repeated. A shadow from a passing cloud drifted over the valley floor, momentarily cooling the ground. The mirage snapped flat. The man at the corner became a solid, distinct outline. She squeezed the trigger. The blast rattled her molars. 8, Cord muttered, watching the man crumple. They were hitting a rhythm now, a morbid assembly line of ballistics and flesh. The enemy commander inside the compound realized his fighters were being dismantled by a ghost. Desperation set in. Instead of trying to fight back, they tried to run. 3 men sprinted from the main compound toward an old, rusted Toyota Hilux parked behind a collapsed mud brick wall. They moved tightly grouped, panic overriding their tactical spacing. "Vehicular exfil," Cord called out. 3 targets. Distance is 3.85. Wind is picking up. 5 milliradians right. Nyari's fingers moved over the turrets, feeling the clicks. Her gloves were soaked with freezing sweat. Her right eye burned from staring unblinking through the high magnification glass. She racked the bolt, the heavy brass casing ejecting and searing a black half-moon into the frost-covered shale beside her knee. She didn't aim at the men. She aimed at the driver's side door of the truck, calculating the time it would take for them to reach it, open it, and slide inside. It was a math problem with moving variables. Human terror, mechanical drag, and gravitational drop. She fired the 9th round just as the first man grabbed the door handle. The heavy bullet arced through the sky, plunging downward in its massive parabolic curve. It punched through the thin roof of the cab and struck the man perfectly in the crown of his head, just as he slipped behind the steering wheel. The truck's horn blared, a steady, obnoxious wail, as the dead man's face collapsed onto the steering column. The 2 remaining men froze in the dust, horrified by the sudden, localized explosion of glass and bone. They had heard nothing. There was no crack of a bullet passing, no boom of a rifle. Just silent, invisible death striking from the heavens. Nyari cycled the bolt. She fired the 10th shot. The man nearest the truck folded at the waist, dropping like a severed marionette. 10, Cord whispered. He wiped a hand across his mouth, leaving a streak of dirt and frozen saliva. God almighty, Teague, the 11th man didn't run. The absolute lack of auditory cues, the impossibility of what was happening to his unit, broke his mind. He simply dropped to his knees in the middle of the courtyard, dropping his AK-47 into the dirt and stared up at the sky. He was looking for a drone. He was looking for an attack helicopter. He wasn't looking at the desolate, snow-dusted ridgeline 3 miles away. Nyari felt a strange, cold knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't empathy, but it wasn't hatred either. It was a profound, hollow exhaustion. She was looking at a man whose reality had just been violently deconstructed, and she was the architect of his nightmare. She centered the crosshairs, held her breath, pulled the trigger. 11, Cord said, his voice stripped of all emotion. Down in the irrigation ditch, the frantic radio chatter from the ODA team had turned to a confused, heavy silence. They were peering over the edge of the dirt berm, watching the compound slowly turn into a graveyard. TOC, this is Dagger 2-1, the young sergeant's voice crackled, sounding entirely bewildered. Enemy fire has ceased. We have multiple tangos down. We don't see the shooter. Who is on station? Commander Castillo's voice came back, quiet and heavy. Dagger. Shooter is Teague. She's overwatching from the ridge. Sit tight. She's clearing the board. Inside the compound, the last 3 men made a final, desperate play. They burst from the reinforced basement of the southern tower, sprinting toward a heavy tree line that flanked the western edge of the valley. If they made it to the trees, the thermal optic wouldn't be able to penetrate the dense, freezing canopy. "Runners!" Cord barked, snapping back into his role. "Left to right. Distance is pushing 3.9. They have maybe 40 yards to the tree line. You have to move fast, Teague." Nyari's shoulder was failing. The muscle was so badly bruised that every time she pulled the stock into her pocket, her arm involuntarily trembled. She forced her grip tighter, digging the bipod legs deeper into the frozen shale to absorb some of the kinetic shock. She tracked the trailing runner. He was lagging behind, a heavy limp slowing his pace. Crack thud. The rifle kicked. The 12th man spun sideways and collapsed into the snow-dusted grass. She didn't wait for Cord to confirm. She racked the bolt, the metal scraping loudly in her own ears, and pushed a fresh round into the chamber. Her breathing was becoming ragged. The thin air was starving her brain of oxygen, making black spots dance around the edges of her vision. She found the 13th man. He was 10 yards from the tree line. She squeezed. The rifle slammed her backward. 13, Cord shouted, the professional detachment finally breaking. He's down, one left. He's at the edge of the trees. The 14th man was the commander. Nyari could tell by the heavy wool coat and the radio pack strapped to his chest. He was 2 strides away from the deep shadows of the pines. At this distance, leading a running target perfectly was a statistical anomaly. It wasn't just math anymore. It was intuition, muscle memory, and a terrifying amount of luck. Nyari let out all the air in her lungs. She held the reticle in the empty space ahead of the running man, guessing the exact millisecond his head would intersect with the crosshair. The trigger broke. The .416 roared for the final time. Nyari didn't look through the scope. The violent recoil threw her off the glass, and she didn't bother getting back on it. She just laid her forehead against the cold steel of the receiver, her eyes closed, listening to the high-pitched ringing in her ears that the suppressor couldn't entirely muffle. For nearly 5 seconds, the ridge was utterly silent. 14, Cord breathed. He slowly pushed himself back from the spotting scope. He didn't cheer. He didn't slap her on the back. He looked down at his data card, at the neat rows of atmospheric calculations and wind calls. And then he looked at the woman lying in the dirt beside him. Nyari rolled onto her side. The movement unlocked the cramped muscles in her abdomen, and her body suddenly rebelled against the adrenaline dump. She turned her head, pulled down her face mask, and dry-heaved violently onto the rocks. Nothing came up but a thin string of yellow bile. She lay there, shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering against the freezing air. She didn't look like an elite operator. She looked like a sick, exhausted civilian who had been beaten with a baseball bat. Cord reached over, unscrewed the cap from his canteen, and handed it to her. He didn't say a word. He just watched her rinse her mouth and spit the pink bloody water into the snow. Dagger 2-1 to TOC, the radio hissed. Compound is entirely black. We are securing the casualties for immediate dust-off. Tell Teague, Jesus, TOC. Tell her we owe her our lives. Nyari ignored the radio. She sat up, wincing as her shoulder ground in its socket, and began breaking down the Barrett. She detached the heavy suppressor, burning the palm of her glove on the scorching metal, and shoved it into her drag bag. Nobody hits at 3.8, Cord said quietly, watching her pack. It wasn't a challenge anymore. It was an admission of defeat. Nyari didn't look up from her bag. She wiped a smear of dried blood off her cheek with the back of her wrist, her face a pale, bruised mask of exhaustion. Math doesn't care what you believe, Owen, she muttered, zipping the heavy canvas bag shut. It just wants you to carry the one. Enjoyed this story? Drop a like, share this video with someone who loves intense military thrillers, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deeply immersive, gritty stories every week. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. What did you think of Nyari's impossible shot? Sound off in the comments below.